Welcome back, everyone, and to those of you who have not been here, welcome. My name is Chris Young, and I'm one of the park rangers here at Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park. This is our final installment of our question and answer session with park historian Jim Ogden this afternoon at 2:45. I want to thank everyone for participating in all of our programming that has happened over the past 3 days, September 18th, 19th, and 20th of 2020. And in the commemoration of the 157th anniversary of the Battle of Chickamauga. We're again seated here in one of the offices in our operations building at Chickamauga Battlefield, flanked by these two bookcases and a picture of the Snodgrass House and one of the guns or cannon of the 4th U.S. Artillery that's up there. Kind of an interesting piece to have this afternoon as the fighting is heating up over on Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge. But before we bring Jim out, I just want to kind of piggyback, if he doesn't mind, on some things that we talked about today in our 1045 session and a few days ago of how kind of immense this battle is. That don't forget that as the fighting is occurring over on Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge, as the breakthrough is occurring, that there are a lot of things going on in this vicinity. Fighting in Kelly Field has occurred during the day. There's going to be marching in what's now Rossville Gap and down Lafayette Road down here to the battlefield with the Reserve Corps. There's going to be fighting down like this morning, the presentation that we made at Glass Mill. There's going to be skirmishing at Lee and Gordon's Mill, and then eventually the Union hospitals will be taken at Crawfish Spring, and hospitals will be taken eventually up here north of the boundary of the modern day Chickamauga battlefield at Colonel Cloud's at Cloud Spring, which was another Union hospital. So there's a lot of moving pieces and a lot going on. And I also want to remind us of what's happening to the west. We talked about John Wilder's brigade and Lilly's battery, the 18th Indiana Light Artillery today, about them disengaging and moving over to Chattanooga Valley on the Chattanooga Valley Road. And they're protecting those trains, those wagons that are heading up into Chattanooga. Those are the Union Army's wagon trains. That's their supply. That's their artery. And so if you think about Wilder and Lilly disengaging and other troops disengaging to help protect those trains, don't think that it's not a very important job, because think about if the Confederate Army were able to break the Union line and then move into Chattanooga Valley, the detriment that that would have on the supplies for the Union Army as it begins retreating into Chattanooga. There's not a viable rail connection to the city. So everything that they need is heading up to Chattanooga or is in Chattanooga. And if that gets cut off, they're going to be in a world of hurt, and the battle may be a lot worse than what it's actually going to become as the sun sets this evening, 157 years ago. So just kind of giving some perspective of just the multitude of things that are going on out there 157 years ago during the Battle of Chickamauga. Not just in a microcosm, but just all of the chaos that's occurring all throughout the area here at Chickamauga Battlefield. So with that, I want to bring Jim Ogden on, because that's who you really want to see. Jim?
Thank you, Chris. And for those of you all who've been with us on other of our live programs over the last 3 days, welcome back. If this is your first participation in one of the lives, thank you for tuning in on this one. And for all of you all, thank you for participating in these programs that the National Military Park is this year conducting to recognize the 157th anniversary of the Battle of Chickamauga, albeit in a virtual fashion, as opposed to what we normally do out on the battlefield itself. And while the National Military Park has not been presenting programs out on the battlefield, I hope that you'll take as many opportunities as possible to come out and make use of some of the resources and study on the ground as the veterans intended when they created the National Military Park.
So Jim, the first question that I want to start off with is happening late morning, early afternoon on September the 20th. And the question is, on September 20th, was there truly animosity between Thomas J. Wood and William Rosecrans to the point that Wood purposely pulled out of the Union Center even though he knew what might happen, we some of us have heard about, he holds up this piece of paper and says, "Now I hold the faithful order of the day." And that Rosecrans had berated him or spoken down to him, and that this is kind of his up and coming. Let me get back at Rosecrans. I know this is going to be a bad decision, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Thomas J. Wood is too professional a soldier to have acted in such a spiteful fashion. Now, he is a professional soldier. He thinks an awful lot of his ability to make judgments. On September the 7th, 8th, and 9th, as the 21st Corps is moving into Lookout Valley and then into Chattanooga, there had been a long series of often very lengthy correspondence between Rosecrans, Crittenden, and Wood over differing interpretations of a reconnaissance in force that Wood had been ordered to conduct in Lookout Valley, and certainly you can say that that Wood, just like Crittenden and even Rosecrans, in that affair acted in a rather petty fashion often. He was at other times in that discussion exerting a professional prerogative. The biggest clue, though, about Wood's mindset at the moment that he receives Rosecrans' order is that he will indeed consult higher authority. Having been moved from reserve onto to the front line, to thereby allow Negley's division to move further to the north, Wood had moved into Alexander McCook's sector. Now, Thomas J. Wood is normally part of Crittenden in the 21st Corps, but Alexander McCook had control of the right half of the Union front line, and Wood is now in that sector. And when Wood received that communication from Rosecrans, McCook was right there. After reading it, handed it to McCook. McCook read it, and McCook said, "Follow the order," and that he, McCook, would take care of getting some of Jefferson Columbus Davis's and Sheridan's troops to take Wood's place. And as Wood ordered his staff officers to order his then 3 brigades out of line to move northward, McCook rode south and ordered Jefferson Davis to move his reserve brigade, Martin's brigade, which had been Haig's, up onto the front line. And he then rode to the closest of Sheridan's brigades, Bernard Leiboldt's brigade, which had been already moved up from the area of the Wooded Glens, is in the south end of the Dyer Field. And he is in the process of explaining to that brigade what it is he wants done when the Confederates happen to strike the line. And some of the other evidence about Wood's mindset is that he will, with Harker's small brigade, launch what turns out to be a very important brief counterattack in the north end of the Dyer Field. And then as Harker withdraws to become part of the force that will defend on Snodgrass Hill, Horseshoe Ridge, Wood, who becomes injured at that time period when his horse falls, he actually is herniated. He will stay on the battlefield through the rest of the engagement, encouraging the men and playing a role. As I said, Wood was too professional a soldier, and will even make those remarks in post-war accounts when asked about the situation on the 20th.
So, kind of adding to that, we have a question moving over to what you just talked about. Leibold is moving to William Lyle. So we had someone ask, I know a lot of the battlefield was forest, but when William Lyle was killed, while the attack was occurring on horseback, was that area open or forest as well? Can you speak about how the Confederates honored him as kind of this poet, soldier, or warrior poet?
You are correct. The majority of the Battle of Chickamauga will unfold in a wooded or forested environment. The majority of this agricultural region at the time, but amazingly today, the largest area of the battlefield really that has a pattern of fields and forests that is very close to what it was in 1863 is the area of the Dyer Farm. Today recognized as the big open fields along Glen Kelly Road, and that Dyer Road bisects as well. The Dyers were a well-to-do family. The patriarch of the family had the financial wherewithal to have acquired 320 acres of land. He bought 2 quarter sections of land, one north of the other. So he has basically a piece of property there that is a half-mile wide and a mile long east and west, and had cleared most of that to bring it under cultivation. And in fact, the south end of the Dyer Farm, the south end of the Dyer Fields, those wood lines are pretty close to what they were at the time. So when Lyle's brigade comes marching up from the area of the Wooded Glens, moving from the Wooded Glens under the orders from Rosecrans to move to the far left of the line, they come over the little rise or shoulder of what we now call Lyle Hill. They are in the woods, open woods, and as they do, Confederates are pouring through the woods, driving Davis's men out of the woods, and Lyle will go into action. First, his 2 left regiments, as he had been deployed, and then his 2 right regiments, and they will wind up fighting astride Glen Kelly Road there, where the monuments are today for the 24th Wisconsin, 21st Michigan, the 36th and 88th Illinois, a little bit downslope from where the shell pyramid for Lyle's fall is located. The top of the hill was wooded. He was there near the edge of the field and the woods, and fortunately, one of the field cornerstones that the veterans erected in the 1890s as they create the battlefield park for that corner of the woods there in what would be the southwest corner of the Dyer Field. That stone survives, and you can find it and see then that Lyle is just a short distance inside of what would have been the very open woods on the top of that hill. So that part of the battlefield looks pretty close to what it was at the time. Lyle's body is quickly recognized by Confederates as they come up in pursuit of the withdrawing Federals from Lyle's brigade in that area. He had an overcoat on that day and buttoned up, but would have had his sword on as well. And so he is quickly recognized as being an officer, and for better or for worse, one of the most common episodes on battlefields throughout time is that the fallen will be rifled through, looted by others, another comrade or an enemy soldier, and Confederate soldiers begin going through the possessions or the equipment and clothing of this fallen Union officer. and will take his watch and his sword and other things, but very quickly it is recognized that this is William Haynes Lyle, a man who had gained some recognition in the late antebellum period, just shortly before the war, for the poem Antony and Cleopatra that he had written and that had been published widely in newspapers across the United States. And when some of these Confederates recognized that they now have possession of the body of Lyle, that is brought to the attention of officers, and a guard is placed over his body, and then subsequent to prevent further looting of the body. And then then later, the body is moved down to the area of the Hindman Division hospitals on the Hunt Farms down near Dalton and Thedford's Ford, where it will be buried. And then shortly into the siege of Chattanooga, an arrangement is made between Rosecrans and Bragg for the return of Lytle's remains to Union lines. And so respecting him for the national figure that he had become in the late 1850s, then ensured that his remains survived identifiable, and to then be taken home and buried in Cincinnati in what is said to be Cincinnati's largest funeral. So other officers who fell on the battlefield aren't necessarily recognized as such, perhaps in part because of Rosecrans' order to reduce the amount of insignia that was being worn, but also probably because they didn't have this fame and recognition, and no one thought, well, maybe we shouldn't loot this body. And very quickly, the fallen officer is stripped of all of the things that might identify him, perhaps an engraved sword that had presented to him, or a pistol, and his pocketbook and other things that might have provided the identity.
Thanks, Jim. So we have another question here that says, it would seem Sheridan had a history of attempting to bail out Rosecrans on collapsing wings. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, it is kind of ironic that at Stones River 9 months before, it is the Union right that will collapse, and that was McCook's sector at Stones River as well. You might not focus that on Sheridan, but maybe go one step higher to McCook, who at Perryville in October of 1862 found himself on the left of the Union line, and largely driven from his initial positions on the battlefield. Sheridan does not write much about Chickamauga in his lengthy memoir. You certainly get the sense that he did not think that was one of his better days, and so he does not spend a great deal of time relating his role in the Battle of Chickamauga. However, it's really not anything that Sheridan did or did not do that makes for the 20th of September being a tough day for Phil Sheridan. Sheridan was already moving with two of his three brigades, and may well have planned to pick up his third brigade as he moved past it, under orders from Rosecrans to shift from the far right of the army to the far left of the army as part of Rosecrans' reaction to the threat of what we know today was just the attack of Breckinridge's small division on the Union left. And even though all three of his brigades will be driven from the field, you can certainly see that happens largely as a result of the situation they find themselves in. Their lines not tied in with anything else really, and being flanked out of position. At the same time, you also have to remember that between Sheridan's men's desire to fight, if they can find a place from which to fight, and what Sheridan himself did, much of Sheridan's division gets reorganized that afternoon of the 20th, and Sheridan, or as they're moving through the hills of Missionary Ridge to McFarland Gap, and Sheridan will then march that reorganized portion of his division up the western side of Missionary Ridge from McFarland Gap to Rossville Gap, and then march it south on the Lafayette Road from Rossville Gap back towards the battlefield. And it's one of the moving pieces that you talked about as you began this this session. So during the whole time of the stand on Snodgrass Hill, you've got Sheridan's division making this move to then come back down the Lafayette Road, and their skirmishers reach the northern edge of the Cloud Hospital complex by dark on September the 20th, and there they learn that the rest of the Union Army has retreated from the field, and Sheridan then pulls back to Rossville Gap. So I think Sheridan's fight is both very illustrative of the situation at the time, and what could well happen to even the very best troops if they found themselves in a similar situation, but also what does happen to very good troops when they have had a tough time and have a moment to catch their breath and reorganize. They are marching back to the sound of the guns as the sound of those guns fade away for the day.
Thanks, Jim. The other question that we had that came in was there any consideration given by the Union High Command the following Monday to the feasibility of holding the line at Rossville and surrounding ridges instead of retreating and getting pinned in Chattanooga?
Well, during the course of the 21st, there is communication between Rosecrans and George Thomas. Thomas is out at Rossville Gap, and the Thomas is going to hold on there to buy some time to allow for more work to be accomplished on the new system of fortifications that is being expanded and developed around the east and south side of Chattanooga. But they make the decision that they will fall back into that developing new line of fortifications after dark on the night of the 21st. However, as the 21st, as darkness approached on the 21st, and there had been no serious attempt by the Confederates to really attack that line, except for some Confederate cavalry under Nathan Bedford Forrest and a little bit of Wheeler's cavalry. Thomas begins to suggest to Rosecrans that very thing. Let's stay out here. But by the time Rosecrans makes the decision that we'll stay out at Rossville and on Missionary Ridge and across Chattanooga Valley from Rossville Gap, enough of the troops who had been on that line throughout the day are on the march back into Chattanooga. And Thomas says, well, now it is too late. And they go ahead and withdraw back into Chattanooga. You've got a number of factors here, the time and distance. They were expecting a much more vigorous pursuit by the Confederates than unfolded. And if there had been a more vigorous pursuit, then perhaps there wouldn't have been even any discussion about potentially staying out there further. So, certainly in hindsight, with what happens on the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, you can build a case that perhaps they should have stayed out at that point. And of course, later on, Rosecrans will be criticized for having surrendered the northern tip of Lookout Mountain to the Confederates, and thereby allowing Confederates to get astride his line of communications. But that all starts to get into to what follows in the coming days, and really, in some ways, we should continue our 157th anniversary recognition daily now until early December. So.
Yeah, it's an ongoing thing. It doesn't stop. One bleeds into the other.
That's right. And one of, in addition to your observations at the start of this session about just how much is going on, and therefore how difficult it is to when you're talking about one phase of the battlefield or visiting that one phase of the battlefield, to then remember what else is happening in other places. And one thing that happens way too often in this story of the campaign for Chattanooga is that Chickamauga and Chattanooga are treated as essentially two separate things. And it really is one continuous operation. And in fact, if you go to William Stark Rosecrans' mindset, you can essentially build a case that this is one continuous operation that begins in late October of 1862, when he is elevated to command of the Department of the Cumberland, because all of these little things feed in one right after another towards this important and significant struggle for the gateway to the Deep South.
Thanks, Jim. In regards to the fighting on Snodgrass Hill, we have someone who has an ancestor in the 4th Kentucky. They were wondering how the retreat occurred. So how did the federal forces essentially retreat off of Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge that evening?
In late afternoon, George Thomas recognizes that he's not going to be able to stay indefinitely on Snodgrass Hill. He gets a message from Rosecrans to withdraw as well, and so Thomas begins planning a phased withdrawal, and he'll drop troops off of both the Kelly Field line and the Snodgrass Hill line. The Kelly Field line will be withdrawn from the south end towards the north end, and so Reynolds' 2 brigades, Turchin and King, will go first. Then Palmer's last troops on the Kelly Field line, and on Snodgrass Hill, Mitchell and Whitaker are dropped back to a blocking position, and then units begin to withdraw back beyond them. And so basically, particularly for a soldier in that element of the 4th Kentucky, of Cruxton's brigade that would have been on Snodgrass Hill, they would have withdrawn through the woods and along the farm lanes that led northwestward from Snodgrass Hill towards McFarland Gap. And initially, a lot of that movement is just through the woods. But as they move further to the west and get closer to the actual corridor of McFarland Gap Road, they will get onto to that corridor. In 1994 and 1995, as preparations and construction actually began on the realignment of U.S. Highway 27 around the west side of the Chickamauga battlefield, we did a little bit of archaeology on the 1 mile stretch of the realignment that was constructed within the Chickamauga battlefield, and that straight segment runs basically north and south, and it bisects a number of these farm lanes or roads that would have been used by these retreating troops as they moved back towards McFarland Gap. And it was interesting what we found in a couple of them where the withdrawal was more disorderly. The artifacts were spread over a wider area on either side of where the road was at the time. In the case of others, where and in those also there were fired projectiles suggesting that they were receiving some fire from the Confederates. In other places where sources suggested and the maps that the veterans had published suggested that the retreat was more orderly and less organized, more organized and less under pressure. The artifacts were concentrated just literally right along where the road was, and so for a lot of these Union soldiers withdrawing from Snodgrass Hill, once they were just a short distance, probably a couple of hundred yards from their battle line, they were largely not under pressure at that time.
Thanks, Jim. This is an interesting question that came in. It hasn't been covered in the Q&As. They want to know what would the weather have been like in September of 1863 here. They say that they're aware that there was a drought and some cold temperatures, but is there any way to kind of expand on that to let them know what the temperature and the weather was like?
Well, the high temperatures for the days of the battle, you see a fairly broad range given by participants. If you're being shot at and running around, being very active, even if it's a little bit cool out, you're going to work up a good sweat and sweat through your clothing. So temperatures in the 70s is probably the high for the day. But the nighttime temperatures, the night of the 18th, the early morning hours of the 19th, the night of the 19th, the early morning hours of the 20th, it had gotten cold enough to frost. And there are accounts that the frost overnight on the night of the 19th, the early morning hours of the 20th, was the temperature was low enough to cause a skim of ice to form on the surface of water in a cup or a bucket that sat still. Even if the daytime temperature was not all that high, even if the nighttime temperature didn't get below, say, 31 or 30 degrees, the fact that you have perspired through your clothing. For many Confederates, they've also forded West Chickamauga Creek. That cool temperature at night is going to be quite debilitating. The cold front that comes through, and typically this region starts to see some slightly cooler weather about this third week in September. Remember, the autumnal equinox is just a couple of days away. In fact, on Tuesday of this coming week this year. Typically there is a little bit of cooler weather around the time when the battle occurs. But in 1863, though, it was much cooler than normal, and it was a big Arctic cold front that thrust south across the middle portion of the United States and down here into the south. There is a forthcoming book by the historian Ken Noe, who teaches at Auburn University. And he is looking at weather in the Civil War and its effects on the campaigns. And this weather incident, the cold snap of late September 1863, is one of the ones he focused on. And he has spent a lot of time looking in newspapers and other sources and kind of tracks this cold front as it sweeps south out of Canada, across Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois, and on southward. There's even snow in the northern part of its reaches as it stretches southward. So, cooler weather at the time of the battle, that's kind of what you can expect. As cold as it was, that was an anomaly at that time.
Thanks, Jim. We had another person ask, not necessarily associated with the 20th of September, but wanted to know about the guerrilla factions that were working in the area prior to the battle. And maybe we can touch a little bit after the battle too, if you'd like.
Yeah, the presence of guerrillas, although guerrillas can also suggest some sanctioned and organized force that is supporting one side or the other. And what actually happens in this region particularly after the campaign and beginning in early 1864 and then going through the rest of the war, is not really guerrilla activity, but it is just the presence of absolute thugs, people who are only out to line their own pockets, to benefit themselves. And Gatewood will be perhaps the most famous of them. Polk Edmonston is another. And some of these will profess loyalty to one side or the other. Some will profess loyalty to one side at one time and another side at another time. But what they really are is simply thugs who are out to benefit themselves. And they will often take advantage of individuals who had been soldiers, who have returned to the area for one reason or another. Some of them are deserters. For some of the citizens around here, they had been members of Confederate units that had been captured and paroled at Vicksburg and have decided not to go back to the Confederate lines. There also, since this was a region of divided sentiments, there are Union sympathizers, some of whom had fled earlier out of Confederate lines, and now they return out of concern for their families and their properties. And very often these thugs will enlist these individuals really at the threat of their lives. And they made life for those who were still attempting to live at home, operate their farms, unbelievably uncomfortable. And in fact, large areas of Tennessee and Kentucky, and now reaching down into Georgia, North Alabama as well, begin to be very badly affected by the presence of these thugs. They will periodically attack a Union or Confederate force or a garrison or a station somewhere if they think it will benefit them. But mostly they are preying on the civilians. And as I said, it would have been a real challenge to be a civilian, to try to remain at home in the last year and a quarter or so of the war. And that really continues into the immediate post-war period until you get local government reestablished to some degree. You get some presence of law enforcement once again. Some of these individuals who are the thugs will go west after the war and will become the early post-Civil War robbers and thieves and thugs on the western frontier until, for many of them, they meet their end somewhere along the way.
Thanks, Jim. I think that we're out of time for this afternoon as question and answer. I want to thank everyone for participating. Jim, do you have any last thoughts or last words that you want to share with everyone on this, the last day of our virtual programming for the 157th anniversary of the Battle of Chickamauga?
Right. Just to reiterate what I said earlier, I hope that certainly for all of you all who live close to the Chickamauga battlefield, even within a day's drive, I hope that you will make many visits to the battlefield for better. Well, right now, given the nature of the vegetation on the battlefield, while visiting right now this time of the year and in the coming weeks, will give you some sense of the nature of the forest at the time of the battle in September of 1863. If you wait and come back in December or January or February or early March, with the vegetation down in the forest, that's the real time now to visit the battlefield, to get out and pick a brigade. Take the map and identify where their commemorative features are on the battlefield, and literally connect the dots on those features. Walk the ground. You'll find little subtleties in the terrain that will give you insights into the action. The veterans here, we're setting aside this ground as a memorial and place of commemoration, but also as a giant outdoor classroom, as they said, so that you can learn and study about some of the most remarkable maneuvers and brilliant fighting in the War of the Rebellion.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks everyone for participating in our anniversaries. And remember, the campaign just didn't stop today. It continues on into November and a little bit beyond Missionary Ridge with Ringgold Gap. So hopefully we'll be able to do some additional programming with you, maybe in the field, maybe some virtually, in the coming months. So just keep following us on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and Instagram, and we will let you know what the coming months will bring as far as programming goes. So we appreciate it, and have a great Sunday afternoon as we commemorate this, the 157th anniversary.